Arkansas outskirts. Noon. The heat shimmered off the cracked earth like smoke. Cicadas droned in the cottonwoods, and the sky above was an unbroken blue, merciless, watching. Near a half-collapsed barn, its roof sagging like tired shoulders, 3 men stood over a woman. Her dress had been torn away and thrown aside, a tangle of fabric caught on the barbed wire fence. She was on her knees in the dust, her back streaked with welts, her shoulders sunburned raw. Bruises colored her arms like rotting fruit. "You're no use to us anymore," said the eldest Morris brother, boots planted wide, a half-chewed toothpick hanging from his lip. His voice was dry and hollow, like something that had died long ago. The younger two chuckled, shifting uneasily in the heat. Their laughter didn't last. The silence that followed was thick, like it didn't want to be disturbed. The woman didn't move. Her long, dust-matted hair veiled her face, but even through it, her gaze was unmistakably hollow. Not pleading, not resisting, just gone. And then the wind shifted. It brought no coolness, only the faint creak of leather, the distant rhythm of hooves. The Morris brothers turned toward the bend in the road, hands instinctively brushing against their hips. What came into view wasn't what they expected. A rider, a woman, alone. She moved with the steady confidence of someone who didn't need to make a show of strength. Her hat shaded her eyes, her duster hung heavy with road dust. A rifle was strapped across her back, untouched. She didn't speak as she approached, didn't reach for her weapon, just dismounted, calm as sunrise, and walked forward like the world wasn't watching. The brothers exchanged glances. The youngest scoffed. "Well now," he muttered. "Ain't you a pretty little—" "Quiet," said the eldest, his voice sharper now, eyes narrowing. The woman, Clara Wilson, strode past them without acknowledgement. She knelt beside the half-naked girl, unfastened the cloak from her own shoulders, and wrapped it gently around the woman's trembling form. Then she stood. "You're coming with me," Clara said. Not a question, not a threat, a statement. Her voice was quiet but rooted deep, like it had grown there, in the soil and sun and silence. Something that couldn't be pulled out. The youngest Morris brother let out a laugh too loud for the moment. "You think you can just take her?" Clara turned, her eyes meeting his with a stillness that made the wind stop. "No," she said. "I am taking her." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The brothers didn't move. Not when Clara reached down and helped the woman to her feet. Not when she guided her gently toward the horse. Not even when the woman, barefoot, silent, wrapped in the very cloak Clara had worn, placed a tentative hand on the saddle. Clara mounted first, reached back, pulled the woman up behind her. The Morris brothers watched as the horse turned, its hooves brushing dust across the broken ground. The rider and her passenger did not look back. And the men, armed, loud, cruel as they were, did nothing to stop them. Not that day. The Wilson Ranch sat at the base of the Blue Hills, where the wind ran quiet and the land forgot how to bloom. It was a place most folks passed by without noticing, tucked into a crease in the earth, hidden behind a curtain of tall grass and cottonwoods. The fence line sagged in places, the barn leaned left from too many storms, and the roof of the house bore a bullet hole from a past no one ever talked about. Clara Wilson had lived there alone since her father's death 7 years ago. She didn't come into town, didn't wave from horseback, didn't send letters or take visitors. Once, she had been known. A hard worker, sharp-eyed, quick with her hands and even quicker to get a job done. She rode like a man, shot straighter than most, and spoke with a quietness that made others lean in. But after her father's burial, she vanished from the world as if swallowed by the hills themselves. The house stood clean, swept daily. The stove was always warm, though no one came to share its heat. The porch boards were sanded smooth by the passing of boots that no longer walked beside her. She kept 3 chairs around the table. She only ever sat in one. Some said she was a widow. Some said she was mad. Others swore she'd once been kind, before life had emptied her out like water from a leaky pail. No one knew for sure. Behind the barn was a grave. Not her father's. That stone sat at the churchyard miles away. This one was different, marked only by a pile of hand-laid stones and a wooden cross left uncarved. It was there she knelt every spring with seeds she never planted. And there, once a year, she left a toy horse made of worn leather and wire. No one asked. No one dared. Clara rode the fence line each dawn, tending to her few head of cattle, mending breaks in the wire, checking for signs of wolves or men. She kept a rifle across her saddle and a knife in her boot. She moved with precision, her body lean from labor and silence. Her face bore no softness, but neither did it carry cruelty. Just the absence of both, as if grief had stolen her capacity for either. In the evening, she sat on the porch with her mug of tea, watching the light fade down the slopes like spilled honey. She listened to the sounds of the land, the creak of trees, the hush of grass, the distant bark of a coyote. She was a woman made of edges, held together by habit and hollow. So when she returned from the Morris place that day, her cloak wrapped around a beaten woman who hadn't spoken a word, it was as if a stone had dropped into still water. Clara didn't speak on the ride back. She guided the horse slow and steady, careful not to jostle her passenger. The woman clung to her only when the wind picked up. Otherwise, she rode like a shadow, silent, shaking, weightless. They arrived just before sunset. Clara dismounted first and offered her hand. The woman didn't take it at first, unsure. But when Clara didn't move, didn't push, the woman reached out and let herself be led down. Her bare feet touched the earth and she winced. Clara said nothing, just opened the door and gestured inside. The house, clean as always, felt suddenly too small. Clara fetched a basin of water, pointed toward the back room, and laid out fresh clothes, simple, plain, hers. The woman took them with a trembling nod. That night, Clara cooked stew from leftover vegetables and dried venison. The woman sat at the table, wrapped in a blanket, eyes downcast. She didn't eat much, didn't look around, just listened. Clara didn't speak either. She'd forgotten how. But she noticed how the woman flinched at the sound of the spoon against the bowl, how she kept glancing toward the door, how her hands curled tight into fists beneath the blanket, ready to bolt. The house that had been so still for years now pulsed with quiet tension. Clara lay awake long after midnight, staring at the beams above her bed. The woman was in the other room in her father's bed. The fire crackled low. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters like old bones. She hadn't meant to bring anyone home. She'd only meant to stop what the Morris brothers were doing, to keep the woman from dying out there. But now she was here, and Clara felt something unfamiliar creeping into the corners of her life. Not fear, not regret, something older. The next morning, Clara found the woman sitting by the stove, still wrapped in the cloak, watching the fire like it held answers. She didn't speak, just nodded once when Clara offered coffee. The silence stretched over the hours like thread on a spindle. But it wasn't empty. It had weight, memory, breath. On the third day, Clara finally heard her voice. The woman had stepped outside into the garden, barefoot, moving slow. She crouched by the rows of dry earth and began to pull weeds with the precision of someone who had done it all her life. Clara brought her water. The woman took it, drank deep, and stared at the hills. "They took everything," she said quietly. "Even my name." Clara said nothing, just stood beside her, the sun pressing down on both of them. The woman didn't cry, and Clara didn't move, but something deep inside her shifted. A tremor through old bones. A memory of a time when helping someone didn't mean opening yourself up to ruin. The wind picked up again, and this time it didn't feel so lonely. The days passed slowly. Clara said little. Annie said nothing at all. That was her name, Annie. Clara learned it on the third day, when the woman whispered it under her breath during a nightmare. The sound was so soft, Clara almost missed it. But she remembered. She always remembered names. Annie kept to herself, never straying far from the house. She moved like someone taught to make herself invisible. Never standing tall, never making noise. She bathed at dawn before Clara rose. Ate only when prompted. stared long at the garden but never stepped past the porch unless alone. At night, the silence thickened. Clara would lie awake, listening to the creak of the windmill and the rustle of mice in the rafters. Then, just before sleep, she'd hear it, the sound of Annie whimpering into her pillow. Not cries, not screams, just the muffled terror of someone who still hadn't made it all the way back to her body. Clara knew that sound. She used to make it herself. She didn't ask questions, didn't press. That wasn't her way. But she watched. She noticed the scar on Annie's shoulder. A small brand, shaped like a circle with a bar through it. The mark of someone once considered property. She noticed how Annie flinched at the sight of knives and startled at the sound of boots on floorboards. She noticed the way Annie took her meals. Quickly, mechanically, like someone who wasn't sure if it was her last. On the 5th day, Clara returned from feeding the stock and found Annie in the garden. Barefoot, bent at the waist, pulling weeds. Her movements were slow but precise, like she wasn't just cleaning the beds but remembering who she had once been while doing it. Clara stood by the porch, arms crossed, saying nothing. The sight stirred something inside her. Not pity, something harder to name, a feeling with bones, with weight. She fetched a pitcher of water and carried it out. Annie looked up as the shadow passed over her. Her eyes, sunken but no longer vacant, met Clara's. "They took everything," Annie said softly, brushing dirt from her fingers. "Even my name." Clara didn't answer, just held out the water. Annie drank, carefully, with both hands on the cup like it might disappear. Then she handed it back. Clara nodded once and turned back to the house. That night, a wind came down from the hills and brought a storm with it, the kind that turned earth to mud and shook shutters from their hinges. Clara had just blown out the lamp when the first crack of thunder hit. She rose and went to the window. Rain was falling hard now, and the livestock pen glowed faintly in the dark from lightning flashes. Something was wrong. She grabbed her boots and coat and stepped outside, breath fogging in the cold. The ewe was in trouble. One of the oldest, lying on her side near the fence, her legs kicking at the mud. Clara moved fast, vaulting the gate, sinking to her knees beside the animal. The ewe was in labor, and the lamb wasn't coming. Clara rolled up her sleeves, shoved her hair out of her face, and got to work. A minute later, a figure appeared at her side. Annie. She wore no coat. Her dress clung to her skin. Her hair was soaked to the scalp. She held a lantern, its beam trembling slightly in her grip. Clara didn't speak. "Hold it here," she said, guiding Annie's hand over the ewe's shoulder. Annie knelt without hesitation, mud rising around her knees. The lantern's beam steadied. The rain fell in sheets now, cold and merciless. Clara reached inside the ewe, fingers searching, heart thudding. The lamb was turned wrong, its back legs tangled. She worked carefully, her hands slick with blood and birth. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, little one." Another bolt of lightning lit the sky. Annie's face was illuminated, drawn, wet, but calm, focused. Clara gave one final pull, and the lamb came free in a rush of movement and sound. It didn't breathe. Clara held it in her hands, willing it to move. She rubbed its chest, cleared its nose. For a long second, nothing. Then a weak bleat. It was alive. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked up. Annie was staring at her, eyes wide. Not with fear, but something close to awe. And Clara, in that moment, saw something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Pride. Not in herself. In what had just happened between them. Two women, soaked to the bone, knee-deep in mud and blood and rain, bringing something into the world that shouldn't have lived. Clara gently laid the lamb beside its mother. She rose to her feet and offered a hand. Annie took it. They walked back to the house in silence, boots sloshing, shoulders touching. They didn't speak that night, not even after the fire was lit and the dry clothes were on. But when Clara brought a blanket to Annie's room, the woman met her eyes, and held them, not with need, not with fear, but with something that hadn't been there before. Recognition. They had crossed a line. Together, they were no longer rescuer and rescued, not just host and guest. Now they were something else. Survivors. And under that old roof, where the ghosts had lived so long in silence, a new kind of quiet took hold. No longer empty, but full of something growing. Something like trust. The storm passed by morning. The sky was washed clean, streaked with silver and pale gold. Dew clung to the tall grass. In the corral, the ewe stood with her newborn lamb, both alive, both breathing. Clara watched from the fence, arms folded across her chest, boots planted deep in the soft mud. She said nothing. Inside the house, Annie brewed tea. It was the first time she touched the stove without Clara's instruction. By noon, the air had turned dry and quiet again, as if the storm had never happened. But everything had shifted. The silence between the two women no longer pressed or weighed. It opened. Annie spoke more now, though in fragments. She asked about the ranch, how long Clara had lived there, whether she'd ever thought about leaving. Clara didn't answer all of it, but she listened. In the afternoons, they worked side by side, mending fence, weeding, brushing down the horse. Annie moved carefully, but not fearfully. The shadows around her eyes were still there, but they no longer swallowed her whole. Clara noticed her humming once. Just a few notes. But it was a sound Clara hadn't heard in her home in 7 years. One night, not long after, a hawk took one of the hens. Clara found the feathers strewn across the yard and the broken wire where the bird had slipped through. She cursed under her breath and set to fixing it. Annie watched from the steps. "You could set a trap," she offered. Clara looked up. "A trap won't stop a hawk. Only a presence will." "You mean a scarecrow?" Clara nodded. Together, they built one from old shirts and straw. Annie gave it a wide-brimmed hat from the coat rack. Clara tied a red ribbon around its throat. By the time they finished, it stood crooked but proud, overlooking the garden like a silent sentinel. That evening, Annie placed 2 cups on the porch. One for Clara, one for herself. They sat for a long time, not talking, just watching the dusk settle over the blue hills. Then Annie spoke. "He was supposed to sell me," she said, voice low. "That was the plan. Take me from the wagon trail, wait a week, then sell me off to some man with coin." She didn't say who he was. She didn't have to. Clara didn't move. "But I fought back," Annie continued. "I tried to run. He didn't like that." A long pause. "They broke my nose, pushed my head underwater, said it'd teach me not to disobey." Clara's hands tightened around her cup. Not from surprise, from memory. "They stopped using my name, started calling me girl. Like it didn't matter." Annie's voice cracked then, the sound sharp and sudden. She looked away. "I started forgetting who I was." Clara set her cup down and looked at her. "You're here now." Annie nodded slowly, but her jaw trembled. "That doesn't mean I'll stay," she whispered. "Does it?" Clara didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she stood, walked into the house, returned a moment later with a box. Old, wooden, the kind that held tools or broken things you didn't have the heart to throw away. She placed it between them. Inside was a bundle of letters, some yellow with age, others torn. A child's drawing, a single tiny boot, and a lock of hair tied with blue ribbon. "My daughter's," Clara said. Her voice so quiet it barely rose above the wind. "She was 4. Annie didn't speak. "She died in winter," Clara said. "Pneumonia. Fast. My father tried to ride for help, but the roads were ice. She died in my arms before dawn." Clara didn't cry. Her face didn't change, but her hands shook as she placed the box back in her lap. "She was all I had left." Annie watched her, lips parted, eyes wide. "After that, I stopped talking, stopped going into town. Folks said I was crazy, said I cursed this land. Maybe I did." "You didn't," Annie said quickly, too quickly. Clara looked at her. Annie swallowed. "You saved me." Clara shook her head. "You saved yourself. I just happened to be there." Annie reached out then, slowly, and touched Clara's hand. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she said. Neither of them moved. "I don't know who I am yet," Annie continued, "but I want to find out." The sun was gone now. The porch bathed in blue shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long and low. Clara squeezed her hand once, then let go. That night, neither of them slept. The lamps stayed off. The windows stayed open. They sat in the dark together, wrapped in quilts, listening to the wind push through the eaves. Outside, the garden grew quietly in the moonlight. Inside, something else began to grow too. Not just safety, not just survival, but the fragile beginning of something that could last. It began with a shadow on the ridge. Clara was bringing in laundry when she saw it. A lone rider paused at the crest of the hill, half silhouetted by the setting sun. He didn't move, just sat on his horse like a man watching something worth remembering. She froze, wet linens dripping in her arms. Annie stepped out from the house, holding a bowl of water from the well. Clara didn't speak, but Annie followed her gaze and went still. The figure didn't approach, didn't wave, just turned after a long moment and rode off down the far slope. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She kept the lamp unlit and sat by the front window with her rifle across her lap. The next morning, the Morris brothers returned. 3 of them riding hard, dust rising like smoke behind their horses. Clara stepped off the porch as they reined in. Annie stood at the window unmoving. The eldest, Caleb Morris, leaned forward in his saddle. His lips twisted in a grin that never reached his eyes. "Well now," he drawled, spitting a long stream of tobacco into the dirt. "Didn't think you'd be foolish enough to keep her." Clara didn't answer. "Thing is," he continued, "she belongs to us. Took her fare, fed her, housed her, and now she's got ideas in her head. Thanks to you." "She's not yours," Clara said, "and never was." "You think this is a storybook?" The youngest brother laughed, swinging down from his horse. "You think kindness changes a thing?" He pulled a length of rope from his saddle, looped it once around his hand. "She's ours," he said, "and you're going to step aside." Clara's eyes didn't move from his. "No," she said. He took another step forward, and Clara lunged. She hit him with her full weight, shoulder to chest, knocking him flat in the dust. The rope slipped from his hands. His head snapped back against a stone. The other 2 froze, stunned. Clara stood, breath sharp, fists clenched. "Leave," she said. The silence was immediate and total. Even the wind seemed to stop. The eldest finally broke it. "You lay hands on my brother, and he's still breathing," Clara cut in, "which is more mercy than you gave her." She didn't look back at the house. "Next time you ride in here," she said, voice low, "you'll find a grave waiting." The younger brother groaned, rolling to his side. The Morris men didn't speak again. They mounted up and turned, galloping hard toward the south trail. When the dust settled, Clara walked back inside. Annie was standing in the kitchen, shaking. "I'll go," she whispered. "I'll go now. I don't want them to hurt you." Clara closed the door behind her. "No one's going anywhere. But you're not a stray dog to be driven off when it's inconvenient." Annie's eyes brimmed, but she said nothing. Clara set the rifle against the wall. "They'll come back," she said. "Men like that don't like being humiliated." Annie nodded, her arms wrapped around herself. "What do we do?" "We prepare." The next 3 days passed in a quiet storm of motion. They patched the fencing, reinforced the doors, gathered supplies from the cellar. Clara re-oiled the rifles and set traps along the main road. Annie sharpened every kitchen knife until they gleamed like whispers. Each night, they took turns watching the ridge. On the 4th morning, smoke curled on the horizon. Not close but not far either. A warning. By noon, hoofprints appeared near the edge of the property. 8, maybe 10 riders. Not a direct approach, just a circle. A message. Annie saw them and went pale. "That's a hunting pattern," she whispered. "They're gauging terrain. Let them." That evening, Clara cleaned the rifle again. Annie made bread, hands trembling, flour staining her arms like chalk dust. They sat at the table but didn't eat. Why do they want me back? Annie asked. They can't sell me now. Not like this. They don't want you, Clara said. They want the story. They want to prove the world stays the same no matter what you do. Annie looked at her. You mean they want to prove I don't get to choose? Clara nodded. Outside, the first owl called. The wind had teeth. That night, neither woman slept. They sat near the fireplace, the rifle between them, and waited. At dawn, the sky turned red. Not the soft red of sunrise. Blood red. Clara saw the figures first, riders coming fast, cutting across the lower field. 5 in the front. More behind. 13 in all. Annie stood at the window. They brought others. Clara nodded. They won't all be brothers. Some'll be men who owe favors. Some'll be worse. Killers. Worse than killers. Cowards who think force makes them brave. She opened the cabinet beneath the stairs. Inside, 2 boxes of ammunition, a pistol, and a jar of gunpowder Clara hadn't touched in years. She handed the pistol to Annie. You ever fire one? No. Learn fast. Annie took it with shaking hands. The horses drew closer, the sound of hooves like thunder. Clara stepped onto the porch. The men stopped 30 feet out, forming a rough semicircle. Caleb Morris rode to the front. No more warnings, he said. Hand her over, and we walk away. No, Clara replied. You think you can stop 13 men? No, she said again. I don't think. I know. Behind her, Annie stepped out, pistol at her side. She wasn't shaking anymore. Caleb's lip curled. You want to die for her? No one's dying today, Clara said. A long silence. Then Caleb leaned forward. You want to play hero, fine. But when we're done, there won't be a board left standing. You'll be ashes and wind. He raised his hand. The men began to move. And that's when it happened. A sound split the air, not a gunshot. A horn. From the ridge. Every head turned. There, on the crest of the hill, rode 7 mounted figures. All of them armed. Faces grim. Rifles gleaming. Annie gasped. I know them. Clara didn't ask how. She saw what mattered. Their presence. Their timing. One of the riders raised a hand. The others fanned out. Caleb stared, then cursed under his breath. They're her people, Annie said. They tracked me. The Morris men faltered. 13 against 2 was a sure thing. 13 against 2 plus 7 more? Less sure. Caleb's face twisted. Fine, he spat. You want her? Keep her. She's not worth the blood. He wheeled his horse around. One by one, the others followed. No one fired. No one died. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. As the riders disappeared down the trail, Clara exhaled slowly. Annie sagged with relief. The newcomers didn't approach. They waited. Clara looked to Annie. Go. Annie hesitated, then nodded. She walked toward them, slow at first, then faster. Clara stood alone on the porch, rifle still in hand. But halfway to the ridge, Annie stopped, turned, and came back. The riders didn't follow. Annie stood beside Clara again. I could have gone. Clara nodded. I know. I'm not running anymore. I know, Clara said again. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, as the wind swept the hill clean. No one spoke, because what they'd just done spoke louder than any words ever could. The Morris men never returned. Not the next morning, not the next week. But Clara didn't let the stillness fool her. Quiet had teeth, and so did men who'd been made fools in front of others. She kept the traps set at the edges of the property, cleaned the rifles every 2 days, let the front gate remain half open. A silent message that she wasn't hiding, but she was watching. She didn't speak of that day. Neither did Annie. They didn't need to. The wind carried enough memory for both of them. And yet, things changed. It was in the little shifts, how Annie walked taller now, how she slept longer through the night. She still jerked awake some mornings, sweating, heart pounding. But she no longer apologized for it. Clara didn't press. She just made coffee and set it by Annie's side without a word. Each morning they worked together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as women with dirt beneath their nails, sunburned skin, and things worth defending. Annie mended the chicken wire. Clara hauled feed. They took turns in the fields. Annie began naming the livestock. Clara never had. When a fox got into the coop, Annie was the one who found it. She didn't scream. She raised the shotgun and fired once, steady, direct. The fox fell. Clara heard it from the barn and came running. Annie stood there, breathing hard, feathers in her hair, the shotgun still warm in her hands. "I didn't want to," she said quietly. "You didn't have to," Clara replied. They buried the hens together. Not because they had to, but because they both understood the cost of letting things rot. That night, they sat on the porch longer than usual. The air was dry and warm. Cicadas buzzed in the tall grass. The hills glowed with the last pink of day. Annie sipped her tea and glanced toward the horizon. "They won't be back." It wasn't a question. "No," Clara agreed. "They won't." Annie nodded. Her hair was tied back now. Not tight, just enough to keep it out of her face while she worked. "I think I know who I am," she said. Clara looked at her. Annie smiled, not wide, not forced. Just real, quiet, present. "I'm not what they did," she said. "I'm not what I lost." Clara didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "I'm not either." They sat in the soft dark until the stars came out. The land held its breath around them, as if afraid to interrupt. Later that night, Clara sat by the front window, rifle across her lap. Not out of fear, but tradition. Annie lay on the floor nearby, half asleep, wrapped in a quilt stitched with fading blue thread. The fire was low. The silence between them was no longer brittle. It was strong, earned. The wind picked up and rattled the shutters. Clara didn't flinch. She only looked out at the land she'd buried her grief in and whispered to herself, "It's over. Not all of it, but enough." The threat was gone. The men who'd come to take had found no ground to stand on. What remained now was theirs. 2 women, 1 house, and the long breath of peace returning. Not loud or triumphant, but slow, steady, and sure, like healing. Spring unfurled slowly across the blue hills, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The frost lingered in the ground well into March, and the first rains were cold and mean, battering the hillsides rather than soaking them. But still, soft as a second chance, things began to grow. Shoots of green pushed through the pale brown of last year's grass. Buds formed on the apple tree that hadn't bloomed in years. The land, after so much silence, stirred. Clara felt it before she saw it. Something loosening, not just in the soil but inside the house, inside her. The porch boards no longer creaked with loneliness. The rooms carried new warmth. The stillness that had once stretched between her and Annie had softened into something else entirely. Comfort, routine, rhythm. The days moved with purpose now. Annie woke first, lighting the stove, boiling water for tea. Clara handled the stock. They traded work without speaking about it. One cleaned the stalls while the other cooked. One patched the roof while the other stitched blankets. No lists, no orders. Just motion shared. The garden was Annie's. She worked it with quiet devotion, coaxing life from dry rows. She planted beans and onions, squash and potatoes, wildflowers along the fence line. Clara never asked why, but she stood at the kitchen window most mornings, watching her. Annie in her old cotton dress, hair tied loosely at her neck, fingers black with soil. There was peace in it, and not the brittle, delicate peace of something new. This was sturdier, grown from hardship, rooted deep. One day, Clara came in from the fields and found the kitchen swept, the windows open. Fresh bread cooled on the counter, wrapped in a cloth she didn't recognize. There were flowers in a chipped teacup on the windowsill, yellow and white, gathered from the hills beyond the pasture. And beside the bread, a note. "This is my home now too." Clara stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was careful but uncertain, as if each word had cost something. She didn't move, just stood there, the breeze moving around her, the scent of bread and earth filling the room. When Annie came in, brushing dirt from her hands, She paused. I wasn't sure, she said, if I should say it. You should've, Clara said softly. Annie gave a half-smile, half-apology. You never asked me to stay. Clara met her eyes. You never needed to be asked. They stood like that for a moment. Two women with pasts like scars, with silence tucked into their bones. Then Clara poured tea, and they sat on the porch, side by side, wrapped in the golden hush of dusk. The hills rolled out in front of them, washed in the warm light of evening. Somewhere a hawk called. The wind carried the scent of lilacs and wood smoke. I used to think this land was cursed, Clara said, that nothing good could live here again. And now? Annie asked. Clara thought for a moment. Now I think it was just waiting. For what? Clara didn't answer right away. For someone who didn't need to be saved, she said finally. Someone who wanted to live. Annie didn't reply. She just reached over, resting her head lightly against Clara's shoulder. This time Clara didn't stiffen. She let it happen. The porch light swayed gently above them. The tea cooled in their hands. And in the silence, there was no fear, no mourning, only breath, only presence, only life. Later, Annie went inside to fetch blankets. Clara stayed on the porch, the stars beginning to show. The land bathed in that soft half-light between night and memory. She thought of her daughter, of how healing didn't come like a flood, but like spring, cautious and slow, unsure if it had the right. But it had come, and it had stayed. When Annie returned, they wrapped themselves in quilts and leaned against each other as the night deepened. No promises were spoken. None were needed. The land no longer felt abandoned. The house no longer echoed. And for the first time in years, the silence between two people was not a void to survive, but a place to rest, place to begin. Of the years she'd spent buried in sorrow,